The mantra is clear for most small business operators. We can't find people to work because of government subsidies, and it's hurting their recovery. But how true does that ring? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. It's a sight seen in many places across the country as lockdowns were eased and restrictions lifted. Small businesses were delighted to resume operation. The only problem was finding people to work. Now, when the pandemic arrived and Canada was shut down, the government filled the financial breach with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. For all those thrown out of work due to COVID, they were able to collect $500 a week to make ends meet. It was a quick response to a dire need for many at no fault of their own. Now, the government has moved the CERB to employment insurance for those still unable to find work. The Canada Recovery Benefit followed for those still jobless or making 50% less than they were. But in the case of the recovery benefit, the payout was reduced to $300 a week. The issue with that is it runs out later this month. Our unpublished.vote question asks, do you feel now is the time for the federal government to wind down the Canada Recovery Benefit? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on right now and vote at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. Coming up on the Unpublished Cafe, Jennifer Robson is an associate professor in political management at Carleton University, and she'll join us to discuss some misinformation about what's available. First, I'm pleased to be joined by Dan Kelly, president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And Dan, is your membership faring any better as some of these restrictions are lifted?
Sure, there's been a slight tick up in sales, but still, if you can imagine, only 19 months into the pandemic, only 75% of businesses, small businesses, are fully open. Only half of them are at full levels of staffing. And most worrisome of all, only 40% of small firms right across Canada are at normal levels of sales. 60% of them are below water. Many of them that are open right now are losing money every single day that they remain open.
Quite often we hear employers say they can't find people to work, but can it all be blamed on CERB and the recovery benefit?
No, not at all. Look, we had a shortage of labor that was growing prior to the pandemic. And then, of course, we didn't really have a big shortage of workers during the worst of the lockdown phase because many sectors were entirely or largely locked down and had no need for workers at that moment. But as we've reopened businesses, many are struggling to get their teams back together. They're recalling workers that they had pre-pandemic to find that either they have moved on to other types of jobs, that they're not willing to come back because they are afraid of COVID. But there is a sizable number of workers that are former workers that are telling their employer, you know what, when else am I going to be able to take a break and be paid to stay at home? This was certainly true over the 2 summers that we've had during COVID, when there was a opening up in the summer of 2020 and then another reopening in the summer of 2021. People just saying, look, I want the summer off. And so call me back in September or October. The real challenge for our members is part-time worker availability. I'm not sure that, and CERB is only a portion of that. There are some workers, of course, in the hospitality industry who have said, gosh, you've hired me, laid me off, hired me, laid me off, hired me, laid me off because of lockdowns. I want a different industry altogether. I'm out. And that is a reality. But so true is the fact that there are employees who have said, $300 a week, I was making basically that by working 10, 15 hours a week prior to the pandemic. I can make that and stay at home. So I'm going to do that.
In terms of the recovery benefit, though, I'm wondering, is it for just part-time? Is it for part-time people as well? I thought this was mainly a full-time employment thing.
No, not at all. You could have worked to collect the CERB originally, and now the CRB stream under EI. You could have worked as little as 5 hours a week.
Wow, that is.
So this is the thing. The challenge is that to be eligible, you only had to work, I think it was 110 hours in the past year to be able to collect $300 a week going forward. And this is one of the reasons why we're so concerned about some of these policies becoming permanent, is that there has been many that have called for the number of hours required to collect EI benefits, regular EI benefits, to be reduced significantly. Our worry is that if you reduce it too significantly, that it does encourage people to stay home rather than go back to work. And I think it is hard for people who are naturally hardworking, naturally attached to the labor force to understand. I think we all know somebody like this, but there are Canadians that will do just about anything not to work. And if we make that too comfortable, too easy for them, that will contribute to a shortage of labor and paying benefits to people that perhaps need that nudge back into the workforce. It's not everybody, certainly, but there's enough of them that it is certainly for part-time workers causing a problem. Under CERB, for example, there was over $600 million paid out to 15-year-olds. That's not what the program was intended to do. And I get that governments needed to do something hasty and that we're going to make some mistakes along the way. But by making it available to very, very part-time workers, we have in fact overcompensated many who are making more on the support programs than they were while working. That just shouldn't be allowed.
The pandemic has exposed some cracks in the employment system. And are your members looking inward to find some solutions to that and to getting more workers back to work?
For sure. Business owners are pulling every single lever possible to try to get back their workforce because they desperately need people. Look, if you've been locked down, I have restaurant members in Toronto, gyms as well, that were locked down for 400 days during the pandemic. Now they're open again. They're desperate to try to bring back customers, but they're not able to serve them. And that's just as devastating if you're not able to actually be able to make money because you don't have the staff to be able to serve your potential customers. So businesses are trying to improve wages where they're able to do that, where they're able to afford that. They're trying to improve working conditions in many instances and create some benefit programs to try to support staff. They're trying to provide more work flexibility than ever before. Where possible, allow working from home. There's all sorts of creative things that employers are trying to do to get people to work in their businesses. But I can tell you one of the obstacles is the fact that we have a compensation stream under the CRB that can compensate them at levels that the employer is just not able to match, especially if you were working, say, 10 hours a week prior to the pandemic.
You brought up the restaurant industry, and I can't imagine anybody in the restaurant industry being very happy right now, in particular with provincial governments, when you look at the fact that, they're still under restrictions and limited seating, et cetera. And here we have, 18,500 at Scotiabank Place here in Ottawa to watch the Leafs and the Senators last night. I can see why they'd be upset. Have you heard from the province on why such a decision?
Oh gosh, there have been all sorts of stupid COVID rules, many necessary, but many just really idiotic rules that the provinces have used, particularly the province of Ontario. Ontario has, for most of the pandemic, had insane policies like allowing Walmart and Costco to sell whatever they want for most of the pandemic, and then shutting down the tiny retailer with 3 customers a day. They're not allowed to open even for a single minute. Now we've got the scenario where 10, 20,000 people can gather in an arena. I watched a segment of the Maple Leafs game, and I'd say about 10% of people were even wearing masks while sitting side by each. That's allowed, but the bowling alley that serves a group of kids is required to only serve 50% of their former volume, even though they've got loads of room for physical distancing. These are some of the stupid policies that the Ford government has used, and they've been just punishing small and medium-sized businesses along the way. And no explanation. I mean, some lame explanations that nobody believes to justify both the retail rules that they used in 2020 and then these new service-oriented business rules, capacity rules that they're using in 2021.
Dan, I want to thank you for joining us.
Anytime at all.
Dan Kelly is the president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Canada's unemployment rate was down last month by 2 basis points to 6.9%. And according to the federal government, employment has returned to pre-pandemic levels, which begs the question, why the gnashing of teeth by employers? Jennifer Robson's an associate professor of political management at Carleton University, and she joins us now. And Jennifer, if employment is back to where it was before COVID, why the trouble hiring? Or were small business dealing with a shortage of employment before it became more exposed?
Great questions. Let's see. So there are still somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 million Canadians who are unemployed. So while the overall unemployment rate is down significantly, this is all good news. There are also a number of Canadians who have exited the workforce and maybe others who have postponed their entry into the workforce. Another thing that's happening, obviously, is an awful lot of churn in the labor market. So, for example, take the restaurant sector. This is one sector that has received an awful lot of attention in terms of having difficulty hiring and retaining staff right now. Relative to pre-pandemic times, it's pretty clear a number of staff who were working in that industry have moved on. So they, perhaps over the last 18 months have found it very difficult to have the unpredictability of when they would and would not be able to work. No doubt, some of the remaining public health measures that are so important for keeping us safe still create some uncertainty and limitations in terms of reliability of shifts. Not to mention, I'm sure it's a difficult time right now to be having to deal with customers on frontline jobs. So, no doubt there are an awful lot of people who are saying, this is an opportunity for me to think about what is next. I realize that for those employers who are looking for staff, this creates some new challenges, but there's a sorting process that is taking place right now in the labor market.
You feel there's some misunderstandings in the public about what's available for employers. What are some of those misunderstandings?
Yeah, I guess so. I hear an awful lot of folks referring in shorthand to CERB, or the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and should it be extended? Should it not be? That kind of thing. And look, there are currently still some residual benefits for both employers as well as individual workers. But CERB itself, that big massive program, $82 billion, it's long gone. It's actually been gone since last year. So employment insurance is back up and running for those workers who qualify. In addition to that, we have the Canada Response Benefit and a series of other temporary benefits in place for people who don't qualify for EI. And I realize that there's some concern about whether or not those ought to be extended or whether they're having a disincentive effect on workers. I do find it interesting, though, that the same employers who are having a hard time, saying that they're having a hard time hiring, have not necessarily done much in terms of boosting their wage levels. And they're also very keen, obviously, on ensuring that their direct benefits in the form of rent subsidies, wage subsidies, and now a hiring program are extended for the individual help to individual workers. I just want to say one thing about those benefits for workers, which is that the recovery benefit, which is, I think, the one that people sort of confuse with being that same behemoth that was in place at the start of the pandemic. There's still about 675,000 people who were 670,000 who got it in the most recent period. We know that an awful lot of people in Canada have been unemployed for 6 months or more, 12 months or more. There are really good questions to ask about whether or not continuing to have a cash benefit is the best way to support people. I haven't heard nearly enough conversation about the importance of job training, employment services, those kinds of things in terms of helping people reconnect to the labor market.
The recovery benefit is to end before the end of the month. Do you expect that's going to happen, or do you expect an extension?
Great question. Look, this is where I also want to delink the recovery benefit from those other, like the sickness and the caregiving benefits, because the sickness and the caregiving benefits, I think, are meant to be more for supporting people who are going to have temporary income interruptions because they have to stay at home, maybe with a kid who has to isolate from school, or they themselves have to go and get tested and wait for results. We're still living in a pandemic, right? It's not quite over. The recovery benefit has a slightly different logic. Look, I checked the system this morning. I don't know if this is indicative or not, but the government is shutting down the application portal for those benefits as of 11 p.m. tonight, and it won't be open again until Monday for system maintenance. Now, I don't know if I should read into the tea leaves that means an extension is coming. The government does have the regulatory power to extend benefits from October 23rd through to November. So maybe they're going to go ahead and do that. Beyond November, I really don't have a clear through line on that. But like I said, regardless of what they do in terms of the expansion or the extension of those benefits, we really need to be doing a better job of connecting unemployed workers up to the services that are going to help them find work again.
How much of the rhetoric that we're hearing about the employment is political?
How much of the rhetoric that we're hearing? I guess it depends on, I mean, look, all rhetoric is political, kind of by definition, right?
Yeah.
The data is the data, but the story that you decide to tell about the data is obviously going to be shaped by your priors, right? And the parts of the data that you want to pay most attention to. I realize, look, even amongst economists, there's sort of, a glass half empty and a glass half full camp. It's a messy story out there, and I get it. There's enough going on that there's sort of a narrative for everybody who has a particular view. There are real problems, though, right? And there are real individual workers and families who've been deeply impacted by this last year and a half, and they're going to need some supports. What we ought to be thinking about is not just purely, there's a magic bullet somehow. We need to be thinking about what's the right mix of supports. I really don't want to see a situation, though, where people end up being basically permanently scarred, falling through the cracks, as it were, and never really able to rebuild. That would be a loss to all of us.
There is a divide out there, and I'm wondering, do you think it might be driven by, when we go back to the beginning of the pandemic, there were those who were deemed essential service, and then obviously those who weren't. Do you think that might have had a bit of an impact on that?
You mean in terms of a perception of whose work is valued and not?
Yeah.
I think actually one thing that changed was that at the beginning of the pandemic, so many people were directly impacted. And you had a situation where I think at one point, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 million Canadians, maybe 9 million Canadians had ever taken at least one CERB payment, right? Which is kind of remarkable when you think about, a country our size and the labor market of about 21 million people. To have that many people actually all using the same program, I think it temporarily changed people's perceptions about the importance of government and the role that government can play in terms of stabilizing people's lives when they've had that kind of shock. As time has gone on, and some people have had an easier time returning to the labor market, regaining lost hours, changing jobs as the case may be. I think that's where we're starting to see a bit more of a divide in terms of people's impatience, perhaps, right? And we all are human beings, and we can fall into that sticky spot of thinking that what has worked for us or what has been good for us is the right thing for all of our fellow citizens and neighbors in the community. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know enough about what's going on with those million unemployed people and the people who are still on CRB. We don't have enough data to make sense of all of this. I think it's kind of dangerous to tell ourselves overly simplified stories.
I wonder if it might be a better way to, when we look at this recovery benefit, if a better way to approach it would be to more in a regional, I guess, approach as opposed to a blanket approach across the country. And the reason I say that is we look at some provinces and areas where things are opening up and they don't have that, the infection rate rising and stuff. So, things are easing up. And meanwhile, you look at Alberta and northern BC, and it's a bit of a basket case there. So obviously you want that shut down. Do you think that would have been maybe a better way to do this?
So the difficulty with that is that at least when it comes to the CRB, like you can actually kind of do things like that a little bit within the employment insurance system, because it's many faults. It's overly complicated, but it has divided Canada up into 60 plus different regions. So you can kind of, tweak stuff and say, we're going to set the parameters so that these kinds of regions get it, these don't. The way that the Canada Revenue Agency has been running these benefits is pretty simple, right? It's a lot of attestation. So how do you make sure to verify where somebody is? I take the point fully that the situation right now in places like northern BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, both in terms of the public health parameters as well as the impacts on the economy, are very different. This is a reminder, like public health is the way that we get back to the full reopening of the economy. That said, one possibility is you download it onto the provinces. They do not have the administrative capabilities to run these kinds of programs. We don't want to download this in terms of pushing people onto provincial social assistance. That's a dead end, right? When I said before that I'm really worried about people being permanently impacted and not being able to participate and rebuild, that's the kind of thing I'm worried about. So I think the government is a bit stuck. Like, you can't have a national program that isn't actually national. I suppose there's maybe a way to try and say, you know, by postal code or whatever, if you're in an impacted region, then you qualify. But, you know, the more parameters that we try and place around this, the more complex the implementation, the more costly it's going to be to administer. Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of debate around, you know, this question about ending the benefits and the lack of employment. It's elevated the question about guaranteed annual income. And do you think it might gain more traction? People might take, want to kick the tires a bit more?
We've had at least, one province do a really major study that wrapped up just at the start of the pandemic. I had the honor of being part of the broader research group that was informing that. The government of Nunavut is likewise taking a look at the feasibility here. I think basic income is one of those topics that it's almost a bit perennial, right? In terms of social policy conversations in Canada, it sort of comes back periodically. The appeal of basic income in terms of simplicity, speed, dignity for the people who are making use of it, I completely get, I completely understand. CERB, that big behemoth program, was really not designed to be a model for a basic income. It just doesn't have the same kinds of features that we might want a basic income to have. It's possible, that building on the work that was done in BC and that is now underway in Nunavut, that other jurisdictions will be interested in this concept. But this is really complicated stuff to actually try and work out in a feasible way that you can actually implement.
Jennifer, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Jennifer Robson is an associate professor of political management at Carleton University. Our unpublished .vote question asks you, do you feel now is the time for the federal government to wind down the Canada Recovery Benefit? Yes, no, or unsure. You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote. I want to thank our guests today, Dan Kelly of the CFIB and Jennifer Robson of Carleton University. And I want to thank you for watching the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.